I was on my way to making another video, and I was on TikTok, and this video popped up. It's the Temptations, and the song is "For Once in My Life," and Paul Williams, who's a member of the Temps, were singing. And I never, as much as I love music, my music knowledge sometimes gets a little stunted because I just go so far. Like my brother is a far more better music historian than I am, so he's probably already knew this. But this is the first time I saw this, and it's they sing about once for once in my life, and Paul Williams, who's a member of the Temptations, is singing his heart out. And it's like, my God, this dude's vocal is so great. It's so powerful. The fact that he wasn't the lead singer of the group is crazy. Because again, the Temptations, you had David Ruffin and Eddie Kendrick. So they was the principal lead singers at first. And shout out to Leon for his portrayal of David Ruffin in the Temptations miniseries, because he should have won an Emmy for that. Fantastic. Y'all ain't nothing without me. I'm the group. Shout out to Leon. So David Ruffin leaves. They kick out David Ruffin. Eddie Kendrick's still there, but he leaves eventually. Dennis Edwards comes in, but Paul Williams is always there. And you would think that Paul Williams would have taken over for David Ruffin, but he was still there. But man, the vocals of this man For Once in My Life is amazing. That's the crazy thing about Motown. There was so many great singers. Like, even with the Supremes, like Diana Ross of the three Supremes, she probably had the weakest vocal. Because Mary Wilson's vocal was really good. And so also was Florence Ballard. Like, Diane was just a star. But sometimes, like, even with Smokey Robinson and the Miracles, like Smokey Robinson had a great higher register. But maybe he wasn't the best singer of the group. Like, that's how great Motown was. The backup singers were just as good as the main lead singer. But Paul Williams is great. My parents used to talk about Paul Williams all the time, because sadly, Paul Williams self-deleted himself in 1973. It's in the Temptations movie. He was in a parking lot and he took himself out. And I guess he told Otis and Melvin of the group he had these thoughts about taking himself out. And he just did it. And it's tragic, man. Again, I say this all the time. If you are in a space where you feel like you're in despair and you don't know where to go, call this number. It's 988. It's a crisis hotline. Please call that number. Because it might save a life, might save your life. But yeah, so Paul Williams, his vocals are tremendous. And when I look at artists today, there are no Paul Williams today. Like, I know if it's a Chris Brown. Chris Brown's a legend in his own right. And when I hear people say, like, man, he's like just as good as Michael Jackson, it's like, no, he doesn't even have Michael's vocal. Even with Michael Jackson, I love Michael Jackson, man. Michael Jackson has a tremendous voice. But when you hear someone like Paul Williams, and that's that deep South, Southern, gospel, raw vocal from the 50s come out in the 1960s. When you hear that, it's almost like Michael is great, but then we hear that rawness. I said this before. Gerald Levert, when he was alive, he said about his dad, Eddie Levert from the OJs, he sounds just like his father. He's like, I'm good, but my dad got another gear that I just don't have. And those guys who came through the 50s, man, the 40s, that 50s era that went to the 60s, man, they had that second soulful gear that most people don't have. The only guy of this era, the only male singer that I think that's actually is the best is probably Bruno Mars. And even as great as Bruno Mars is, he doesn't even come close to Paul Williams' vocals on this song. Now, the funny thing about For Once in My Life, because like, oh, they redid the Stevie Wonder song. Nah. No. Stevie didn't even write that song. It is the Stevie Wonder song, because Stevie Wonder released that in 1968. The song was originally written in the 1960s for Motown. I think it was a guy named Ron Miller and Orlando Murden that was part of the writing staff of Motown. They wrote that song. And there was a couple of female artists, I think a woman named Jean and a woman named Connie, who actually sang that song in 65 or something like that, but I don't think it were hits. But then something crazy happened in 1967. Like, all these people, all these groups on Motown started to remake the song. The Four Tops made a version of For Once in My Life. The Temptations they sang their version of Once in My Life. Tony Bennett, who's not even part of Motown, he sang his version of Once in My Life. And each and every time For Once in My Life was a slowed down song. Stevie Wonder also remade that song in 1967. But Stevie was like, I love the Temps, I love the Four Tops, but they all putting out this song in 1967. I know you guys want me to put that song out too, Well, I'm gonna put on 1968. And he put that thing out in 1968, and that's the version that we hear. That's that version, that great version of Stevie Wonder's For Once in My Life that's become legendary. But as the years go along, you feel like, oh, well, that's Stevie Wonder. Like, he wrote that song. He didn't even write that song. That's how great Stevie Wonder was, man. He takes someone else's song and just made it his own. It's fantastic. I just there was this whole thing right now on Twitter. It was about R. Kelly. And some guy was saying, like, R. Kelly was the greatest songwriter, American songwriter ever. Now, you know, I separate R. Kelly, the artist, from R. Kelly, the inmate, right? And R. Kelly was a tremendous songwriter. Like, he did stuff like You Remind Me of My Jeep, but he also did I Believe I Can Fly. That's just two different gears. But he's not the greatest songwriter of his generation. I'm always going to give that to, there's a lot of them. Stevie Wonder is probably near the top for me. You got Lennon McCartney. You got Leonard Bernstein. You got to incorporate everything. You got to incorporate R&B, even if you want to incorporate hip hop into that. You got to incorporate classical. You got to incorporate dance. You got to incorporate country. Like, there's so many great songwriters. But Stevie Wonder to me is like one of the greatest songwriters ever. And the fact that he had to fight Motown, because Berry Gordy was not going to allow him to write and produce his own stuff. Like, Berry Gordy had that system in Motown where he had, I got the singers, I got the writers, I got the background singers, and I got the bands. And that's the system. It's a conveyor belt system, because he worked at, I think, Ford or someplace like that in Detroit. And his whole idea was Motown was going to be like a factory. It's a factory of music. So we got the writers and the producers and the backup singers and the bands, and then we got the artists. But Stevie Wonder was like, no, I want to do my own stuff. So he had to fight. He had to fight Berry Gordy for that. Marvin Gaye had to fight for that. Like, Berry wasn't trying to let that happen. But then he just relented. Because I don't know, where would we be if Stevie Wonder wasn't allowed to write his own music? That Berry Gordy was like, no, I'm not allowing that. You just write this. You just sing the stuff we're going to give you. Where would we be right now? How many great songs we have missed out on? Shout out to Stevie Wonder, but shout out to Paul Williams. Tremendous singer. That's a good question. Who do you think that came through back in the day who was a really great singer that doesn't get enough love? Like, from an artist standpoint, I always say Donny Hathaway. I think Donny Hathaway is one of the greatest singers ever. And he had so much competition in the 80s. You know, he had to fight through all of these guys like Al Green and Barry White and Isaac Hayes and Stevie Wonder. He had to fight through all those guys because there were so many great singers then. But someone like Paul Williams, who's gotten lost in the history of R&B, because there's another Paul Williams. There's the short Paul Williams, who was a songwriter in the 70s. So usually when you say the name Paul Williams, people there's three Paul Williams. Like, from a soap opera standpoint, there's Paul Williams that's on Young and the Restless. And then in the 70s, you have the short artist, Paul Williams, that came through the 70s. That's him. But when it comes to, like, the Temptations, Paul Williams, I feel bad because when we talk about the Temps, we talk about David, Eddie, Des Edwards, Melvin, Otis, but we forget about Paul. So shout out to Paul Williams, one of the greatest singers ever. Be sure to check out for his version of For Once in My Life. I'm going to listen to this again because it's so great. I'm going to listen to the Stevie Wonder version. But I'm also going to check out the Tony Bennett version and the Four Tops version and the early versions that was originally written for those young ladies from Motown who didn't become stars, but given the talent they had at Motown, they probably was really, really, really good too.